insightful information. All right, so welcome again to the truth about shoulder pain. I'm going to share my screen. So you should see a lead screen that says the truth about shoulder pain and my name on there. As I was just saying, if you have any questions at all, I relish the opportunity to interact with you tonight. So just click on the chat button. You can chat in there and that'll alert me that you have a question. I'll do my best to answer those in real time, and I'm going to give you my contact information at the end. First of all, though, just a wee little bit about me. Why in the world would you want to listen to me? That's a really good question. So just telling you a little bit about myself. I'm a physical therapist. After going to Dordt College in Northwest Iowa many years ago, I went to the University of Iowa for their master's program in physical therapy. And been a physical therapist now, practicing for 27 plus years, primarily in an outpatient musculoskeletal environment. Shoulder pain is the second most common reason that people come to see us. So we've seen a lot of people with shoulder issues over the past 27 years. Got my doctorate degree about 11 years ago now. And though I think I've been very well prepared academically, really the most important thing is all the experience that I've gotten. I've worked with a lot of people and see trends and patterns develop that I'm going to tell you about tonight in my time as a physical therapist. My company, Kinetic Edge Physical Therapy, has 8 clinics, mostly in central and south central Iowa, although we consult with employers throughout the state and throughout the country to help with work injury management and prevention related tasks. We've been around for over 25 years now. And like I said, shoulder problems are really common. We see a ton of them, second only to lower back pain. What you're learning from me tonight is stuff that I've learned, but it's also stuff I've learned from all my different colleagues. We have over 40 physical therapy and physical therapist assistant providers within the practice that share the work, and I love learning with and from all of those people as well. One of the things we'll briefly touch on tonight is unique to our philosophy in three-dimensional movement analysis and performance. It's called 3D maps. Your shoulder does not exist in a vacuum. It's part of a dynamic movement system. And though it's made to move in a certain specific way, the most important thing is that it moves in concert with the entire body, and it operates just like your entire movement system between gravity and the ground. And so what we're going to learn about is how to make sure your shoulder is doing what it's supposed to do so it doesn't experience the stress that can sometimes cause cumulative trauma. In fact, it's not just about your shoulder doing what it's supposed to do, but it's all the neighbors of the shoulder doing what they're supposed to do as well, so that all that work can be shared appropriately amongst all the body parts. How in the world do I know if I can help you? Well, this would help me understand that. This is a time for you to click that chat button. I want you to tell me, if you would please, very briefly, is there a specific activity that you do, position or posture or motion, that you know is going to make your shoulder hurt? That's an aggravating activity. So just type that down, hit that chat button and type it out. If you want to give me a little more information, the next 2 questions are interesting as well. How bad is the pain on the 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being emergency room pain? And then how long have you experienced it? Now, those last 2 questions, how high does it get on the pain scale and how long have you experienced it? That doesn't tell me if we can help you, but it sometimes tells me the severity of your problem. The longer you've had it and the higher the pain, it's an indication that it's more irritated, and it generally takes a little bit more time to get it to take shape again. But we can get it to take shape, and we know we can get it to take shape in most cases if you can say there's a specific activity that is aggravating for you. So maybe this describes you. Here are the 3 most common things that people will say when I ask them, tell me what makes your shoulder hurt. They'll tell me when they reach either forward or overhead. That's aggravating for the involved shoulder. When they try to lift something, particularly when they're lifting it away from their body, reaching into the fridge to pick up a gallon of milk is something that I hear often is aggravating for a shoulder. And then also laying down. We'll talk about why laying down can be problematic. That's not just laying down on your shoulder, although that can be even more aggravating. Just the act of laying down can be problematic. All right, so a few people are saying some stuff here. Someone said they had septic shock in 2019 and it started a month later. From 4 to 10 on the scale, cold is problematic. So Melanie says reaching back, 1 at best, 8 at the worst, about a year. Okay, so those, oops, shoot, they just disappeared on me. Let me try to find it. Oh goodness, I've got a little thing happening here. All right, and sitting at the computer, says Rose, 5 or 6 on the 1 to 10 scale, several years. Lifting, says Sue, laying down since January, intermittent, up to 4 on both shoulders. Okay, good. Those are really, really good pieces of information. Thanks for sharing that. Here's what I'll say about that. The higher the pain and the more the longer the length of time you've been dealing with it, it probably means it's going to take a little bit more time. But if you have a specific activity, in a weird way, that's kind of good news, because we know that if your pain is reproducible, it's also reducible. There it comes, pushing all these buttons. So that kind of rhymes, right? If your pain is reproducible, it's also reducible, because we know that there's something that brings it on. There's also something that would make it less. That means it's a mechanical problem. We'll talk a little bit about mechanical issues in just a little bit. I first want to introduce you to the concept of trauma. Not a new concept to you, I'm sure. But when you think of the word trauma, be honest, what do you think about? Most people are going to say things like motor vehicle accident or blood or a fracture. When we think of trauma, we think of the big and bad stuff. And that's one type of trauma. In fact, that's called acute trauma. Acute trauma is something that happens suddenly as a result of a major stress. And acute trauma, if we graph it here, looks like this: sudden tissue damage, and then as time goes by, days, weeks, and months, the symptoms get worse. I'm sorry, over time they get better, and they get below that symptom threshold. So here's the deal: when your tissues experience injury, when there's tissue damage as a result of one stressor applied, when that stress is no longer present, the tissues are made to get better. So acute trauma tends to get better over time because it's just one exposure that caused it on the front end. And there are people that we see in our clinic that have experienced acute shoulder trauma, and we have to help them through that process. That occurs, but it's less numerous, less common than cumulative trauma is. So cumulative trauma looks a lot different than acute trauma. Cumulative trauma is slowly building over time. And that slow angled up arrow that you see on there is, on my screen, took a few seconds to get to the top. That could take months or years to develop. And notice that dotted line, the symptom threshold. A change was happening before you hit the symptom threshold. Changes occur in our body before we're even aware of it because we don't feel it yet. And when it gets just above that symptom threshold, that's when people say things like this: it's not that bad, but I can feel it. It's just got a little problem, and it's bearable. I don't want to be a squeaky wheel. They excuse that kind of pain. They downplay it because we're human and we don't like to be squeaky wheels. But if we continue to expose ourselves to the same cumulative stresses over time, little bits of stress repeated often and regularly, it tends to build. And as time goes by, it becomes more frequent, more intense, and more significant in duration. So if that's your story, you can raise your hand. I'm sure you're not alone. Now, you saw those buckets on my screen there. So kind of a weird thing, but I want to give you a bucket analogy because this tells you a little bit about how cumulative trauma operates. It is slow and insidious, but it's actually quite predictable. When our tissues change, the first thing we generally notice is fatigue. There's a little in the bucket. All right. So I'm 52 years old. I've been a physical therapist for over half my life. Physical therapy isn't physically demanding most of the time. I'm not lifting heavy weights all the time. So I'm not exposed to all those kinds of physical stressors that some people are. That being said, today, by the end of the day and the end of the week, I have more fatigue than I did when I was 26 years old, for sure. because my body is wearing out. It's breaking down. That's normal and expected. And so we all kind of understand that that's the case. And so we don't do a whole lot about that. And generally speaking, as time goes by, more water fills the bucket. And as we get more water, it goes from being just kind of fatigue related to a little higher level of an issue. At this point, most people will describe discomfort. Now, what is discomfort? It's not pain per se. A little stiff, a little sore. At this stage, people need a little bit more time to warm themselves up. They need a little bit more recovery time after being exposed to levels of exertion that they're not accustomed to. And again, I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I hear that all the time. We excuse this, which is kind of normal. That's how we kind of mentally manage the aging process. And so we usually continue to be exposed to the same kind of stressors. More water fills that bucket, and eventually discomfort, stiffness, and soreness can give way to pain. Now it really hurts. It's not the same level. It's a higher level of discomfort. It hurts. And that's pretty close to this overflow that can occur when the water leaves your bucket. And that's when you got true tissue injury. That's something that takes more time and energy to manage. So that's the path. This bucket is the cumulative trauma path. And if you look down the railroad tracks there, rounding the bend, there's a train. And if you're standing on those tracks, at some point in time when that train is far enough off, we don't even know it's around. And the first things we notice when a train approaches us is we might feel a little rumble, hear a little something in the distance. Maybe that whistle is blowing, okay? But we know it's far off, so we don't do anything about it. We keep walking. And as that if that train gets closer and closer, the signs of its pending danger get more and more significant. It's louder and higher vibration. This is kind of cumulative trauma. As we get farther and farther along the path, the pain becomes more frequent, more intense, longer in duration. And unfortunately, when we hurt less, we move less. And when we move less, our general health is at risk. In fact, the number one reason that people spend medical dollars, the highest medical expenditure in America easily, are musculoskeletal issues. So shoulder pain, back pain, hip pain, knee pain, all those kinds of pains, musculoskeletal issues, the number one cost. Number two, I think, is obesity. It's cancer. It's obesity, it's depression, and cardiac-related issues. 5 of the top 6 most common healthcare expenditures are positively or negatively influenced by our movement. With less movement, we're more at risk for musculoskeletal issues. We're more at risk for diabetes. We're more at risk for obesity. We're more at risk for depression. We're more at risk for the most common healthcare expenditures. And so we're actually talking about something that's really good for your shoulder, but it's good for your general health as well. But unfortunately, if you're like most, when we first are made aware that we might have a problem, the natural tendency, as I said a little bit ago, is to downplay it, to excuse it, to kind of ignore it. So I'm sitting here in a new edition, 1990s edition to an old home, a home built in 1915. We bought the house and moved here in 2015 and called the insurance company to get it insured. They sent someone over to take a look at it and said, yeah, we'll insure this. This is good, except not that roof. Those shingles, they're old. They're not in good shape. They need to be replaced. And I looked at a house and it was big, and I knew that the shingles were going to cost a lot to replace. So guess what I did? I ignored it. I went inside and I looked up and I didn't see any sign of any damage. Surely I can wait a little bit longer. Now, I'm happy to report that I did get those shingles replaced, and it didn't lead to bigger issues. But I was playing a risk game with that. And I've heard of people who ignore those problems, and then when you get water inside, there's major damage, and something that was going to be somewhat expensive gets really expensive in a hurry. And I didn't have insurance covering that, so that was smart, but that was not smart. But I did what many people do. We know there's a problem, doesn't seem that bad, we ignore it. That's the single greatest mistake that people make, but it's pretty common. Now, you're not at that stage anymore with your shoulder because you're here tonight. You're not ignoring it. You're trying to do something about it. In fact, I'm sure you've probably already tried to do something about that. And I'm here to kind of apologize to you about that, because many of the things the medical industry doesn't truly fix the problem. It just kind of masks the problem. The most common treatments for any kind of a musculoskeletal issue are injections, medications, see a specialist, get a diagnostic test, potentially get a surgery. All those things are dealing with the symptoms, helping you with the discomfort, but not necessarily asking the question behind the question. Why is that occurring in the first place? And if we can figure that out, shouldn't we try to do something about that? Because just doing a temporary fix by injecting it or doing a surgery, if you haven't fixed the thing that brought it on in the first place, what's to prevent it from coming on again? Nothing, unless you find and fix the root of the problem. That's the key to solving it. So that's what we're going to talk about the remainder of tonight. Now, in order to do that, I want you to understand this key point. It makes sense that we would think about these shoulder issues like a medical problem, right? That's what we were trained to see it. But I'm here to tell you tonight, it's not so much a medical problem as it is a mechanical problem. What do I mean by that? Well, if you lift up your sleeve and take a look at your shoulder, there's not a dial that it says, oh, look at that, we're low on ibuprofen. If I just give it some more ibuprofen, then I'm going to be balanced and I'll be good again. Okay? It's not that way. You can't successfully manage a mechanical problem with a chemistry treatment, but that's often what we do. That's what Western medicine often does. It looks at the problem in a bucket, it isolates it, it doesn't understand all the dynamics that are influencing it, and it treats the symptom more than the root of the problem. And so that often is rife with issues, even in physical therapy, ultrasounds and electrical stimulations. Don't get me wrong, those things can be done. It's okay to do those things because it can help make you feel better. But our job as physical therapists are not to make you feel better only. It's to make sure that you're functioning well, to make sure that the stress is off that tissue. Because when you experience mechanical stress, little by little over time, cumulative trauma occurs. More pain, more frequent, more intense, longer in duration. It's not that. It's not a medical problem. You need a movement solution. Find ways to take stress off that tissue. Go back to the root of the problem, and you can have solutions that last. Now, I want to point out one thing very briefly here. When you hear that you've got an inflamed joint, what's your natural tendency to that? So here's what we're trained to say. Oh, inflammation? We can do something about that. I can take an anti-inflammatory. Okay? Anti-inflammatory will take away that inflammation. Inflammation, bad. We see inflammation as a bad thing. Take a look at this, though. Phase 2 of tissue healing is called the inflammatory phase, or the inflammation phase. From about day 3 to the end of week 3, after we experience tissue injury, there's going to be inflammation. And guess what? That's normal and it's good. Inflammation is the process by which the body begins to develop a framework to grow blood vessels. And that framework, when it goes through proliferation and eventually maturation, it matures to the point where we have a solid framework of vasculature, which carries blood and all the nutrients that the blood carries to a tissue. If that tissue doesn't go through inflammation to proliferation to maturation, that tissue is not going to get resources it needs to stay healthy over time. So we don't want to stop the inflammation process. We want the inflammation process to do what it's intended to do, to lead to the proliferation and maturation phase. So I would say that we are taking fool's gold to some degree when we pop the anti-inflammatory, whether it's a prescription or an over-the-counter medication like ibuprofen. We have gotten too accustomed to doing that, and ultimately at our long-term peril. Before we get into the most common types and reasons for shoulder pain, I want to tell you my story about John. John, I got to know about 25 years ago, and at that time he was 92. I was working in Cedar Rapids at the time, and he shows up at the clinic that I was working at saying, Troy, I've got a real bad shoulder problem, and it's been happening gradually over time, and it's to the point where I can't even get to the top of my head, and it hurts. He was a widower. He had lived by himself. He wanted to continue to live by himself, but he couldn't do what he wanted to do. In fact, he had gone to doctors, he'd gotten medications, injections, eventually had an MRI that showed a massive rotator cuff tear. That's a major one. right? But he said, I don't want to have a surgery. In fact, the doctor said, I don't really want to do surgery on you because you're old and that's not good on the heart. So he came to me saying, can you help me, Troy? And I'll be honest with you, as I was with him, I told him, boy, I don't know. I don't know, John. You've got a major tear. Okay. And this isn't a new thing. This has been here for a while. What in the world can we do about this? Now, I told him, I can't make that rotator cuff regenerate. We just can't do that. A solution doesn't exist. And even if we try to do a surgery, getting a major tear like that to fix itself and be functional again, that's really hard. But here's what I can do, John. We can make sure all your other body parts are doing everything they're designed to do as well as possible. And we'll kind of see. We'll see what happens with your shoulder. And lo and behold, he said, let's do it, Troy. And he did the stuff he was supposed to do. He worked in the clinic with me. He worked at home. And the end result is he could comb his hair. He could get into the top. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional and it felt good because we recognized that the shoulder didn't exist in a vacuum. It worked with the neighboring joints and tissues, and we took a comprehensive approach at fixing that. So that's what you're going to learn a little bit more about as we talk about the most common types of shoulder pain, and that'll lead way to the most common root causes, eventually treatment. Very, very briefly, I want you to understand what the shoulder is. The shoulder is very complex. It is a ball and socket joint at its most basic level, just like your hip. But your hip is a really deep socket with a ball that fits well within it. It's a much more stable joint and a less mobile joint at the hip. Your shoulder, however, though it is a ball and socket joint, it's not a deep socket. It's kind of a shallow socket. In fact, it's often likened to a golf ball setting on a tee or something similar to that. And as a result, it's much more mobile. It's much less stable. And we need these things called the rotator cuff muscles to stabilize that shoulder. The role of the rotator cuff is to rotate the shoulder, but functionally, we don't do a whole lot with our elbows in and the arms rotating. Functionally, we reach in space. And what the rotator cuff needs to do as we reach in space is it needs to make little fine motor control corrections to keep the ball centered on the socket, to keep that ball centered on the tee. And when those muscles do their job really well the way they're supposed to, the shoulder function seems simple. We take it for granted. But it's not simple. It's pretty complex. Shoulder anatomy, there are 4 bones that make up the shoulder joints. So you've got the collarbone, the shoulder blade, you've got the humerus bone as a part of that too, and actually connects into the sternum as well. There are 4 joints actually, in addition to the glenohumeral joint. There's the collarbone's connection to the sternum, the collarbone's connection to the scapula, in addition to the glenohumeral joints. It's kind of a rule of 4s here. There are 4 rotator cuff muscles and the tendons that connect them to the bone. And the most commonly involved one is called the supraspinatus. And like every other part of your body, every other joint in your body, the shoulder moves 3-dimensionally. What does that mean? Well, I think it's easiest to think about 3-dimensional motion when you think about your spine. The spine flexes and extends, okay? That's called sagittal plane movement. The spine side bends left and right. That's called frontal plane movement. And the spine rotates left and right. That's transverse plane movement. Your shoulder does the same thing, all 3 planes of movement. It's just a much more mobile joint that requires dynamic stability from those 4 rotator cuff muscles. It really depends a lot on a lot of body parts to do its job well. So the most common types of shoulder pain, the interesting thing about shoulders is what we're going to talk about in all 3 of these things is that one can kind of lead to the other. We're going to talk about impingement of your shoulder. I should probably change the order because impingement will lead to rotator cuff strains. Well, actually, this is a pretty good order. The arthritis in that can put pressure on the joint, causing impingement, and then there's enough impingement over time, it can strain and eventually tear the rotator cuff. So what we're talking about with this are just a description of the shoulder pain types. It's not really talking about cause. Let's first talk about the most common type, osteoarthritis. It's known as the wear and tear phenomenon. That results in a loss of cartilage. The joint space starts to narrow. You can get bone spurs, also called osteophytes, that result from this mechanical compression of bone to bone. Here's something that's really interesting, though. Your cartilage doesn't have any nerve endings. So when cartilage gets damaged, that in and of itself does not hurt. So that's very unlikely to be the primary cause of shoulder pain. And here's the other thing. Osteoarthritis, when we are found to have it, we think that we are in trouble. We think that we're destined for a life of problems. That's what we're trained to think. But here's some good news. 40-year-olds, and I would guess most of us on here tonight are older than 40 years old. I am. Okay. If you took 100 40-year-olds that have no shoulder pain and you did an MRI, almost 9 out of 10 of them would show evidence of osteoarthritis. As we get a little bit older, the evidence gets more significant. But I'm here to tell you, arthritis is as normal as wrinkles on the skin. It's a normal part of aging. The presence of arthritis is not directly correlated with pain. It's just kind of a correlated finding with that, okay? So it's pretty normal. But again, the question behind the question is, why is that thing wearing out like that? If it's wearing out a little faster than it ought to, what's the root cause of that? Now let's talk about impingement, okay? So now we're seeing the supraspinatus tendon, one of those 4 rotator cuff muscles turns into a tendon, which connects to the upper arm bone. And the role of that supraspinatus when we raise our arm is to twist the ball so it stays centered on the socket. And if that muscle isn't doing its job well, instead of it turning, spinning on the socket, it gets elevated and it starts to push against those roof bones and everything in between, the tendon and the bursa, which is a fluid-filled sac that's supposed to be a shock absorber, gets irritated and it takes up more space. And as a result, it gets inflamed, which will make us painful. It will get swollen, which takes up more space, and it leads to more mechanical stress as time goes by. Okay. Now, one thing to note is that subacromial space, when you have impingement, is probably going to be narrowed. When we lay down, what starts at 5 millimeters shrinks to about 2 millimeters. That space is narrower and narrower. And when you get more compression, because of that narrowing, there's more friction of the parts that move together. That friction leads to an inflammatory response, which is why we're painful. And we are, of course, then tempted to take an anti-inflammatory, which probably will make us feel a little bit better, but we haven't solved the mechanical issue. Why is that compression occurring? We need to get that muscle to do its job well. Now, in most cases, impingement doesn't even show up on any diagnostic tests. It's very treatable, especially if we get to it early enough. It does not require surgery. In most cases, in fact, subacromial decompressions have proven to be not very effective because if you don't fix the movements issue, there's still other ways for that tissue to get impinged. So I think that some note needs to be made, and it's important. The shoulder is designed, like every other part, to experience some stress. We are made to be dealing with physical stresses, right? And high levels of pressure of the shoulder are pretty normal part of different shoulder functions. But those symptoms become present when it gets irritated enough because the threshold, the demand that we're placing on that tissue exceeds its design limitations, okay? And that's going to lead to inflammation, which is a healing response. But the original source of the problem is mechanical pressure due to a movement-based problem. And if you haven't fixed the movement-based problem, you're not truly getting to the root of it. It's not any better. Now, if you have osteoarthritis, if you develop bone spurs, those bone spurs put pressure on the joint, and that creates an impingement situation. The tendon gets inflamed, and over time, that tendon can get weak. And what starts as a strain of the muscle and tendon can eventually become a cumulative mechanical tear. Now, this tear that you see here is pretty significant. That is a massive tear. And over time, this tendon is going to retreat and separate from its origin or insertion at one point in time. Okay. Now, those rotator cuff strains are pretty common. But again, a lot of stuff is common even amongst people that don't have shoulder pain. So this is looking at 60 plus year olds. Of those that have no shoulder pain, over half of them will have some evidence of rotator cuff tear. So hear that again. 54% of 60-year-olds that don't experience shoulder pain do have a rotator cuff tear. So the presence of a tear does not mean you're going to have pain. We got to get that thing to function right. Okay. Just looking at all people under the age of 60, an MRI is going to show 34% of those with no pain have a rotator cuff tear. And actually, they've done this study where they do a real surgical repair compared to a sham surgical repair. In one group, they're actually getting some repair work done. The other one, they just go in there and they don't do anything. And they find that the outcomes are about the same. So that's kind of interesting. And I'm not going to go into each of these, but I'm going to tell you this. There's tons of evidence that diagnostic tests don't really tell a good story because lots of painless people have funny findings. The only reason you know you have a funny finding is because you hurt and they decided to take a picture, and then you equate what you see with what you feel, which isn't the case necessarily, because lots of people that don't have pain when they check for the same things have the same things that you have going on in your shoulder. And this isn't just true of the shoulder. This is true at necks and backs and knees and ankles and hips. The presence of a pathology does not necessarily correlate with pain. So don't do things to fix pathologies. Do things to fix the mechanical origin of your pain. That's my goal for you. So what are those true causes? Well, when I talk about cause, I mean a culprit. What is the culprit? Well, we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about your shoulder blade. We're going to talk about your hips, believe it or not. We're going to talk about your mid-back, mid to upper back, thoracic spine, and the rib cage that connects to that. And again, I'm going to point out that all of these parts, the shoulder, the hip, the back, every part of your body is meant to move three-dimensionally. And a healthy joint is one that has a balance between mobility and stability. If you have a joint that's way too mobile and not stable enough, that's dysfunctional. If you have a joint that's way too stable and not mobile enough, that's dysfunctional. We need a balance between mobility and stability at the hip, at the back, the shoulder blade, at the arm, all of those parts. If each part is doing what it's designed to do with a balance of mobility and stability, no one part's going to take additional stress. So here's my analogy for this. Here's a metaphor for you. Think about two people working at on an assembly line. Okay, one guy does something else to it. The next guy does something else to the product, and off it goes. And if one gentleman says, "Well, I don't feel like working today," the other guy says, "Holy cow, I got to work hard to cover for that extra person who's taking the time off. And for a day, he can handle it. Maybe for a week, he can handle it. But if that person slacks for too long, the other person that's carrying the additional load is going to be the one with the problem, with the pain, right? But the problem is the person not working. The pain is the person carrying the additional load, compensating for the person that doesn't do what he's supposed to do. That happens all the time in the human body. Find the problem area. And that could be your shoulder blade. All right. The shoulder blade's amazing. It's a floating bone that sits on the rib cage. If you don't think your shoulder blade is important, think about this. There are 21 different muscles that attach to it. That's a major intersection. Okay. And all these dynamic parts have to create this concert of movement that's shared from your trunk through your arm. It's that symphony, that crossroads of movement from the trunk to the arm. Now think about this. When your arm's at your side, that's 0 degrees. When it's all the way overhead, that's 180 degrees. That doesn't all come from the ball and socket joint. About 120 degrees comes from the ball moving on the socket. 60 degrees happens because your shoulder blade rotates upward. Now with a lot of people, as we look at their shoulder blade gets stuck. It doesn't roll upward. And if you're lifting the arm, the shoulder blade isn't dancing with it, you're eventually going to have that humerus making contact with the roof of your shoulder. And so we need to make sure that both your shoulder blade is contributing to the elevation with upward rotation, and the upper arm can move relative to the shoulder blade. They need to share that work. I want to show you this. This is a really good depiction of what happens in concert with movement between your arm and your shoulder blade. So I'll talk you through it. Let's see if it's going to run here tonight. Sometimes we've had troubles with this. There we go. I think they're going to lift it up to the side first. So this is abduction. You can see how much upward rotation occurs to maintain some clearance between that ball and socket and the roof of the shoulder. 60 degrees with the upper rotation of the shoulder blade, 120 degrees of movement of that upper arm bone on the scapula on the shoulder. Okay, I think he's going to raise it up in front only to 90 degrees. And what you're going to see on that one is that the shoulder blade starts to move away from the thoracic spine. I hope you can appreciate how much scapular movement has to occur on the rib cage just to lift it up to 90 degrees. You see that? Called protraction, movement of that shoulder blade away from the thoracic spine. It's moving slow tonight. And I think they're actually going to have a person reach behind the back, and you're going to see that shoulder blade retract and almost cover up the thoracic spine in order to get behind the back or the hip with that arm. It's a lot of stuff. All right, got it. So if the shoulder blade doesn't move in concert with that upper arm bone, it's going to cause a reduction of space in the subacromial joint and that supraspinatus tendon and that bursa, particularly if you already have osteoarthritic changes and some bone spurs or osteophytes in that area. So the shoulder blade won't move well if it's too tight, or if the thoracic spine itself doesn't move very well. You have to clear the thoracic spine and that shoulder blade in order to make sure you can have that symphony of movement. This is a simple image of a person at different angles. This just show fascial connections, the fascia that connects the body. And you can see how it's kind of an X pattern. Your right shoulder is connected to your left hip, right through there. Your left shoulder is connected to your right hip. The hips can generate a lot of force that travel through that fascia into the trunk and up into the arms. I'm a big baseball fan. Imagine if they made a rule that outfielders could only throw if they sat on their bottom. Okay, that doesn't work very well. To generate that throwing motion through the arm and the shoulder whip that occurs to throw the ball hard to the infield, you have to push through the foot, which engages the hip, which gets the hip movement through the trunk, the shoulder blade to the arm. It's a one thing leads to another. It's a whip action that occurs with that. In fact, 50% of the motion that happens at the shoulder is generated from the hip itself. And so any limitation of hip mobility in any of the 6 directions, the 3 planes of movements, can have an impact on your shoulder. And it's not just a limitation of hip mobility. Sometimes it's too mobile a hip too. Again, remember, we need a balance between mobility and stability. A little bit ago, I was talking about the shoulder blade. Now it sits upon your rib cage, and the rib cage connects to the thoracic spine. Movement of the thoracic spine and rib cage stimulates movement of the shoulder blade. And many times when the shoulder blade doesn't move, the thoracic spine is locked down too. Try this for a moment, if you would, please. Slouch. Okay, you don't hear the therapist say it much, but just slouch. Now try to rotate your spine. From a slouch position, we can't rotate very well. But if you sit up tall, and then try to rotate, you can feel how that unlocks your thoracic spine to rotate. You actually feel your shoulder blades start to move. I do a lot of thoracic mobility thing to help people function better with their shoulder. It is absolutely critical. The bottom line is this: if you've had issues with your shoulders and you've done the typical thing, you seek help and you've gotten medications and maybe even injections, in some cases, some of you have had surgeries, but you're still dealing with issues, maybe because you haven't looked at the true movement related issue. You need to clear your shoulder blade movement. You need to clear your hips. You need to get the thoracic spine and the rib cage moving properly. You need to ensure that there's balance between mobility and stability in all 3 planes for all of those various parts so that they can work well together. Because when one doesn't do its job very well, other parts have to compensate for that. Pick up the slack, just like the 2 operators on the assembly line. So it's not going to be very surprising, I'm sure, at this point for you to hear me say this. If you want to truly eliminate the problem, you got to find the root cause. And unfortunately, the most common treatments, medications, injections, and surgeries do not get to the root of the problem. It's kind of fool's gold. Might mask it for a while, but it tends to come back because the mechanical issue hasn't been solved. So successful treatment understands that the shoulder is part of a dynamic system. We find the missing link or the challenged dysfunctional link or links, which often is not the shoulder. Remember, the source of the problem and the source of the pain is the tissue that's been compensating and doing more because of a dysfunctional problematic movement elsewhere. And you got to look at those main culprits to figure out where that is. You can't consider the shoulder's existence without considering its neighbors and how all those parts work together. It's a whole body global assessment. The process of getting better is both educational and empowering. What you do today needs to change as your body changes so that you can build on the foundation. And though we're allowed to work with people in a group setting, I would not encourage that because it's not very individualized. You need one-on-one treatment so you're doing the right thing at the right time to develop and build on that foundation. And it's okay to do hands-on activities, and I do some shoulder stretching. I'll do some independent thoracic mobility stuff too. But ultimately, we need that motion to happen between gravity and the ground. It needs to happen in real functional environments. So hands-on mobility-related work should be combined with movement and exercise as well. All right, so you've learned a lot of things. I'm sure there's a lot of you out there that are kind of nodding your head saying, that really makes sense. I don't know why I haven't heard this before. So we've solved some problems, but we haven't solved every problem. Number one, our memories are limited. You can't retain all this stuff. And even if you could, in this format, we can't tell you what your areas of dysfunction truly are. You don't know what your real problem is. In fact, it's impossible to know that just by hearing me. You need to have someone take a quick look at that thing. And knowledge, though it's nice to have some knowledge, knowledge itself doesn't really help us. It helps us when we can actually implement the things that we've learned. You need to not only know the tools that you need to use, but you need to put them into practice. And so for being good listeners tonight and giving me some of your time, I want to offer you a shoulder pain relief consultation. Here's the deal. It's really quick. It's only 20 minutes. A little bit of question and answer time and a brief assessment of those three main areas. What's happening at your shoulder blade? What's happening at your thoracic spine? What's happening at your hip? And in a very brief amount of time, one of our shoulder pain experts can probably tell you, here's what type of stuff you're dealing with. Here's the real root cause or root causes. In many cases, it's more than one thing. And this is what a solution for this would look like. We'll kind of tell you what the process looks like so you can gain confidence and direction and some hope with this. I think there are great benefits to doing this. I've worked with so many people who've ultimately wasted time and money and resources doing things that only mask the problem and have never got to the root of the problem. This gives you the opportunity to kind of take control over your own health and find the root of the problem and do something about that. It's natural, it doesn't require any medications. It's not a risky procedure at all. And ultimately, it gives you a unique solution for your unique problem. The value of this is $150. I'm happy to say for you, I'm going to offer it for free. So all you got to do is say yes tonight. Now, I'm not taking your money, so I can't give you a money back guarantee, but I'll tell you this. If you do this and say, well, that was a waste of my time, I didn't learn anything, let me know. I'll give you my information in a little bit. The value of that time, even though we're not asking you to pay it, is $150. If you find it lacking in value, just tell us and we will give $150 to your favorite charity. We like doing that kind of thing, but I'm happy to say I've never had someone take me up on that offer because it's not a waste of time. It's really important to find that out, and it's pretty easy to find it out as well. And beyond that, there's no pressure. We tell you what the process looks like, and it's completely up to you. You will at the very least get a little consultation summary so you know what the problem is, what the culprits are, and what the process will look like. That's yours to take home. How do you sign up for this? Probably the simplest way. If you got a QR code reader with your phone, you can do that, and that gets you to a sign-up spot. The easiest way, though, is just to click on that chat button and say, I'm in. Just do that right now. And we need to know then where you want to be seen. So when you do that, when you sign up, just say, I'm in, and tell me what clinic works best for you. So here are the options. We have a clinic in Ames, in Des Moines, in Colfax and in Newton, in Pella, in Oskaloosa, in Albia, and in Centerville. Okay, so I'll say that again. Which one is closest to you? Ames, Des Moines, Colfax, Newton, Pella, Oskaloosa, Albia, and Centerville. So just say I'm in and tell me where you want to be seen. And if you're not close to those, we can do an online session too. That's an option as well. We can learn a lot through some online assessments with that. So I promised you also my contact info. We got some coming in here. Let me get on this. Okay, Lisa, hi there in Albia. There you go. Let's see. John says Des Moines. So John, we will, if you registered, we have your information, and we'll give you a call and get that settled. Rose says Centerville. That's great. I'll have the Centerville group call you. Larry says Pella. You want to do in Pella. Daniel says Ames. Daniel will get you in Ames. That's awesome. Thanks a lot. Let's see. Melanie says Ames as well. T, I won't do your last name, but you're in Pella. Oh, from Merrill Williams. Okay, so Merrill Williams. Back surgery on Monday. Okay, well, good luck to you, Merrill. And tell you what, we'll reach out to you and see if we can find a time, but we'll give you time to recover from the back too. If you need to be helped with the back, we can help you with that too. That's for sure. Deanne says Oskaloosa. Sue says Ames. Let's see. Okay, Joel, you're always working with Joel and Pella. So just let Joel know that you've talked to me, and if you want to do a shoulder screen, he can help you with that too. Here's the deal, though. A lot of the same things that help people with lower back pain are effective, important for shoulder things too, because that dysfunction, for most people that have both lower back and shoulder issues, the thoracic spine is the primary issue. That's the common denominator between those two things. Now, there are specifically some things you'll need to do for the shoulder to complement that too, which would be helpful for you. So just let Joel know that as well. All right, there's a few more coming through. I'll make sure we get this. By the way, if you want to reach out to me, that cell phone is for me. Troy Vienna at Kinetic Edge PT is my email address. It gets directly to my inbox. I welcome you to send me an email. The emails you've been getting after registering, you can respond to that if you want to as well. That will eventually get to me. Tassie will get those to me. And by the way, later tonight or tomorrow, sometimes you will get a follow-up email that has a link to this video if you want to watch it again. I'm going to ask you a favor. If you know other people that are dealing with shoulder pain, forward it to them. Give them the opportunity to hear this information as well. It's good for people to know that. But just know this, sometimes it's a simple solution and you do the right thing very quickly and it gets better. If your pain's lower and you've had it for a shorter period of time, that's easier. If your pain's more significant, you've had a longer period of time, it takes a little bit more work. There's a strategy to do that. But I can never guarantee that you're going to be painless and 100% function. But I can tell you that if we take away stress on that tissue, you will have less pain in frequency, intensity, and duration, which helps you function more comfortably. That is a very achievable goal. And it just takes a little consistent effort on your part as we walk you through that process. I appreciate your time tonight. Appreciate you giving me some of that valuable time. And if you have further questions, I do welcome you to reach out and ask those directly. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.